I think that just as we're living in a nuclear age, we have grown so tremendously in scientific knowledge. It doesn't seem too much to say that men can begin to awaken to the fact that they haven't grown enough spiritually and haven't recognized their spiritual capacities.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class, but today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life itself.
Political Philosophy is a Maurin Academy podcast. So, we've only done one episode on Federalist 51, this scintillating document of American liberty. And we got to this paragraph last time, which was about human nature. This is the most famous quote, I think, that there is from the Federalist Papers. And it has to do with human nature. I won't go over it a whole lot again, but it bears repeating that they didn't think that human nature was perfectible, the founders. And this is an inheritance of the Christian religion. And it's more than that, but certainly the Christian heritage had something to do with this view on human nature. It's basically Augustinian realism in a way. It has to do with the idea of original sin or just inherent morally flawed character of human beings. So this sentence means anarchism can't work because people aren't perfect enough to rule themselves without government. And this sentence here has to do with, and we don't want a pope or a religious leader of some kind or a monarch who claims divine right or anything like that. If God himself could come down and govern men, I think they would probably say, yeah, that's okay. But that's not what they were concerned about. So I wanted to make that really clear. And because neither one of these two things are likely to ever happen in all their perfection, then you need a government that will, yes, control the people, but also control itself, right? So that people don't lose their liberty. The American regime was founded on liberty. And so he then moves on. Let's just say this is Madison, because there's a little disagreement there about who the author is, but it probably was Madison. And so he says, a dependence on the people is no doubt the primary control on government, but experience has taught mankind necessity of auxiliary precautions. So the fact that the people made the government by and for them, and that they have elections that control some of the government, but not all directly, especially not at that time, because the Senate in the U.S. Congress was appointed by the state legislators, okay? But anyway, like that was, he's saying, the fact that the people made it, it's by and for the people, it has some control over the workings of government. But experience, he says, has taught us that we need more than that, that's not enough to control the government. So he says, this policy of supplying by opposite and rival interests the defect of better motives might be traced throughout the whole system of human affairs, private as well as public. He's already kind of referred to this idea of checking and balancing or opposing rival interests above and in other papers as well. And here he's just saying that this is the way people tend to proceed when they want to sort of preserve their liberty, is to make sure that no one party has, or no one body has all the power. Okay. So then he says, we see it particularly displayed in all the subordinate distributions of power, where the constant aim is to divide and arrange the several offices in such a manner as that each may check the other that the private interest of every individual may be a sentinel over the public rights. So again, we see this done all over the place at every level of human organization. We count on self-interest of people in different positions to basically safeguard their own positions, because it is in their self-interest to do so. And so this is, in other words, he's saying this isn't a new invention, really. This is something that people do. And then he says these inventions of prudence cannot be less requisite in the distribution of the supreme powers of the state. So it's even more important that this type of, precaution, this way of sort of making sure that the power isn't too concentrated, really needs to happen at the highest level in the federal government. Then he says, but it is not possible to give to each department an equal power of self-defense against the other. And that's because, he says, in Republican government, the legislative authority necessarily predominates. Res publica means ruled by the people. And we have a republic in the United States. And so he's saying in a republic where the people rule, the legislature necessarily is more powerful. And that would be simply because the people made the government, and the legislature, in our case, the Congress, is the most closely responsive to the people, especially because we have two branches, as he's going to discuss in just a moment, the House of Representatives, which is frequently and directly elected. The representatives are elected by the people. So that authority must predominate because, after all, we are a republic. Okay, so in effect, here we see Madison saying that the legislature is not supreme, but is more powerful and should be more powerful than either the executive or the judicial branches of government. Okay, the remedy for this inconveniency is to divide the legislature into two different branches. So here he's talking about, because it is necessarily stronger and more predominant, but that could become a problem, that could be dangerous. So we will divide the legislature into these two different branches. Now, we know them as the House of Representatives and the Senate. And then he says to render them by different modes of election and different principles of action, as little connected with each other as the nature of their common functions and their common dependence on the society will admit. So there we have a reference to the fact that the House of Representatives is directly elected by voters in their respective states. But the Senate at this time, as they conceived it, was going to be appointed by state legislatures. So each state legislature would send two people to the Senate. Those senators were not directly elected by people as they are now. Okay. And this would mean that they would be more like the House of Commons and the House of Lords. Right? This was kind of a reflection on that whole concept. All right. And he says it may even be necessary to guard against dangerous encroachments by still further precautions, as the weight of the legislative authority requires that it should be thus divided. The weakness of the executive may require, on the other hand, that it should be fortified. Okay, so we still need to work further to make sure that the legislature isn't too supreme. So we need to make the executive stronger. So, we have now a sort of imperial presidency. We've had one since probably the 1970s, at least, in the United States, in the sense that our executive branch has really grown bigger and bigger and stronger. But as you can see, that wasn't exactly the way the founders originally intended. Not at all, actually. And so actually here we have Madison asking the question, how can we make the executive branch that is naturally weaker than the legislature, a little bit stronger. Well, we've already divided the legislature to weaken it a bit. What should we do to make the executive be able to stand up to the power of the legislature? Okay, then he goes on to say, an absolute negative on the legislature appears at first view to be the natural defense with which the executive magistrate should be armed. Okay, so that's a reference to the veto. The president is the executive magistrate, and he should be armed with the veto. Okay, but he says perhaps it would neither be altogether safe nor alone sufficient. And why? Why might not the veto be alone sufficient? He says on ordinary occasions, it might not be exerted with the requisite firmness, and on extraordinary occasions, it might be perfidiously abused. So there might be a tendency for the president to not use it at all, and therefore not really push back against legislative power. On the other hand, you might have a president that is constantly vetoing everything because he's insane or something, and so this alone is not good enough. And then he says, may not this defect of an absolute negative, the fact that it may not always be used well, be supplied by some qualified connection between this weaker department and the weaker branch of the stronger department? Now, this is a notoriously murky phrase, right? It just gets worse too. It's very difficult. Okay, especially since we no longer think of the executive branch as the weaker. But he's saying, could there not be some sort of connection made between the presidency, the weaker department, and the Senate, the weaker branch of the legislature? Okay, by which the latter, meaning the Senate, may be led to support the constitutional rights of the former, the presidency, without being too much detached from the rights of its own department. If the principles on which these observations are founded be just as I persuade myself they are, and they be applied as a criterion to the several state constitutions and to the federal constitution, it will be found that if the latter, the federal constitution, does not perfectly correspond with them, the former are infinitely less able to bear such a test. He seems to be saying state constitutions are not very well armed here on this score. But as far as the first part of this sentence, here I think maybe he is referring to the fact that the Senate, being in a sort of more aristocratic position, at least back then, the way it was originally conceived, would be perhaps less likely to override the veto of the executive than the House, which would be seen as more reactive and because of a more popular power. Then he moves on. There are, moreover, two considerations particularly applicable to the federal system of America, which place that system in a very interesting point of view. First, in a single republic, all the power surrendered by the people is submitted to the administration of a single government, and the usurpations are guarded against by a division of the government into distinct and separate departments. So here he's saying, in a single republic, meaning in a regular republic that doesn't have smaller republics within it, which we call states, okay? Normally in a republic that isn't federal in nature, the main guard against usurpations of power, power grabs, is just the division of government into the different departments and the pitting of them against each other. But then he uses the phrase compound republic, which is a reference to the federal system in which we have all the states and their respective powers, but under the overarching power of the national government. He says, in the compound republic of America, the power surrendered by the people is first divided between two distinct governments, and then the portion allotted to each subdivided among distinct and separate departments. Hence, a double security arises to the rights of the people. If the different governments will control each other at the same time that each will be controlled by itself. So here we have this vision of, the state governments, to the extent that they're built well, and there's a reference above to maybe they're not all built the same with the same level of quality, but if they're built well, the state governments will have their own checks and balances within them. And the state governments will be jealous of their own power, and they will make arguments to the effect of, hey, if we should be able to do quite a bit of our own legislating and in rule making here at this level where we know exactly what we need, right, and what we want. And at the federal level, that level, there will be this kind of jealousy of its own power too. And so to a certain extent, these two will work together, but they will also kind of constantly be headbutting for power, and that's good. Okay. I think this is something that Americans need to realize, is that conflict is essential for liberty, right? So headbutting, although it's very unpleasant, and politics, though it is, well, a lot of people don't like politics because it seems like it can get pretty rough and negative, but continual headbutting is the only way that people can be free in this type of liberal system. So there he's saying the state and the federal, they can butt heads a bit, and this will help to keep people free. And then he says, second, it is of great importance in a republic not only to guard the society against the oppression of its rulers, but to guard one part of the society against the injustice of the other part. Different interests necessarily exist in different classes of citizens. If a majority be united by a common interest, the rights of the minority will be insecure. So here he's posing the same sort of question that he did in Federalist 10, which is we also have to figure out how to guard society at every level against the overarching power of the majority, so that minorities will be secure. So obviously they had a vision, the founders did, that everybody in America would be able to be free and exercise their liberty, regardless of whether they're in the majority or in the minority in any particular case, whether it be political party, which they didn't particularly like political parties, but religious groups, or economic interests, or whatever it may be. All right. There are but two methods of providing against this evil, which they just referenced, right? The tendency of the majority to dominate the minority. The one method is by creating a will in the community independent of the majority, that is, of the society itself. The other, by comprehending in the society so many separate descriptions of citizens as will render an unjust combination of a majority of the whole very improbable, if not impractical. The first method is kind of Rousseauian in nature. Probably had Rousseau in mind when he wrote this, right? Try to create a society that really thinks of itself as a society, right? Where people are able to feel themselves as citizens most of the time, parts of a larger whole with a lot of shared and common interests. Basically, Madison is saying, not likely, okay? The other is what he basically goes for instead, right? Having so many different types of citizens with so many different in competing interests that you couldn't get that kind of combination, right, of a majority that's stuck together very long on all fronts. Not possible. You can have a majority on this issue and on that issue, and you can even have a majority for a while on multiple issues across the board, and maybe that's made worse by political parties. But in the long run, he thought most likely those types of combinations wouldn't. wouldn't occur or wouldn't hold for very long. Further, he says the first method prevails in all governments possessing an hereditary or self-appointed authority. This at best is but a precarious security because a power independent of the society may as well espouse the unjust views of the major as the rightful interests of the minor party, and may possibly be turned against both parties. So in the case of a monarchy, the idea is that the monarch kind of represents society and allows society to achieve that cohesion, so that people can think of themselves as parts of that greater whole. But he's saying this is not a very good precaution against the possibility of the majority trampling on the minority. And that's because the unifying person, the monarch or the self-appointed authority, might just decide that it's willing to be oppressive and to trample on the minor party, the minority's rights, and might actually be also just be tyrannical, is what he's saying there. So in a practical sense, that type of unity is achieved by this idea of, sort of like a founder, legislator, or, father figure, something like this that can create the unity. But again, once you place your country into the hands of the singular individual or the small, very small group, you can have your rights trampled on. And then he says the second method will be exemplified in the federal government or the Federal Republic of the United States. While all authority in it will be derived from and dependent on the society itself will be broken into so many parts, interests, and classes of citizens that the rights of individuals or of the minority will be in little danger from interested combinations of the majority. Combinations meaning cabals or, factions of the majority. We'll continue with this next time, but obviously the American founders were very concerned to protect people's liberty. And they tried to put into place numerous precautions. And one of the things I want to leave us with this time is that they assumed that the legislature would always be more powerful than the executive branch. But over time, our executive branch has become much more powerful than the founders wanted it to be. Decade after decade, the American executive branch has taken more and more power. And we have to ask ourselves, why did Americans let that happen? Well, there's something about modernity, something about the way that we have developed economically and technologically that has led to people caring less, I think, about their liberty. Or the idea of liberty has been in the process of being reformulated to mean something different than it did to the founders. Perhaps it means economic security. Maybe it means feeling equal in self-esteem or in the esteem of others. But what it meant for the founders was literally the ability to do what you wanted to and say what you wanted to say without undue interference from other people. And this type of liberty required toleration, and it was guaranteed or supposed to be guaranteed by the system of checks and balances.